I woke up on my 63rd birthday to an empty house and the crushing realization that I had spent 4 decades living for everyone but myself. My name is Margaret, and this is the story of how I finally found the courage to reclaim my life, even though it meant losing everything I thought mattered. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as I stood alone, staring at the single cupcake I had bought for myself the day before. No cards, no calls, not even a text message. My husband Robert was already at the golf course. My daughter Jessica was too busy with her career in Boston. And my son Michael, well, he hadn't spoken to me in 3 years after I refused to keep funding his failed business ventures. I lit the candle on that cupcake, and instead of making a wish, I asked myself a question that would change everything. What about my life? Before I continue, I want to ask you something. If this story is resonating with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, please click that subscribe button. I'm working toward reaching 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to me. It takes just a second, but it helps this channel grow and reach others who might need to hear this story. Now, let me tell you what happened next. I sat down at that kitchen table, the same table where I had served thousands of meals, helped with countless homework assignments, and listened to everyone else's problems for 40 years. I pulled out a notebook, something I hadn't done since college, and I started writing. I wrote down every dream I had abandoned, every sacrifice I had made, every time I had said yes when I wanted to say no. The list was 7 pages long, 7 pages of a life unlived. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote in capital letters, "What about my life?" Robert came home around noon, his golf shirt still pristine, his face ruddy from the sun, and probably a few beers at the clubhouse. He walked past me without a word, grabbed a sandwich from the refrigerator, and settled into his recliner to watch television. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, really looked at him for the first time in years. When had we stopped being partners? When had I become just the woman who kept his house clean and his stomach full? That evening, I made his favorite dinner, pot roast with all the trimmings. As we sat across from each other, I cleared my throat. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I said his name 3 times before he looked up from his phone. When he finally met my eyes, I told him we needed to talk. The irritation on his face was immediate. He asked if it could wait until after the game. I said no. It had waited 40 years already. It couldn't wait another minute. I told him I wasn't happy. I told him I felt invisible, unappreciated, taken for granted. I told him I couldn't remember the last time he had asked me how I was feeling or what I wanted to do. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam, 40 years of silence breaking all at once. Robert stared at me like I had grown a second head. He set down his fork with deliberate slowness and asked me what on earth I was talking about. He said I had everything a woman could want: a beautiful home, financial security, grown children. What more did I need? If you're listening to this and thinking about your own life, about your own dreams and desires, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're building a community here of people who refuse to be invisible anymore. Your subscription helps spread these stories to others who need to hear them. Thank you. And let's continue. I tried to explain that I needed more than just things, that I needed purpose and passion and partnership. Robert laughed, actually laughed, and told me I was being ridiculous. He said I was having some kind of midlife crisis, except I was past midlife. So what was I having? An end-of-life crisis. His words were like knives. He told me to stop being dramatic, that I had responsibilities, that I should be grateful for what I had. Then he got up from the table, left his half-eaten dinner, and went back to his television show. I sat there in the dining room we had carefully decorated together 35 years ago, surrounded by wedding china we only used on holidays, and I realized something profound. I had been waiting for permission to live my own life. Permission from my husband, from my children, from society, From everyone except the one person whose permission actually mattered. Mine. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I went for a walk without telling anyone where I was going or when I would be back. I walked through our suburban neighborhood, past perfectly manicured lawns and houses that all looked the same, and I kept walking until I reached the downtown area of our small Connecticut town. I found myself standing in front of the community college, staring at a bulletin board filled with course offerings. My eyes landed on a flyer for an art class, Introduction to Watercolor Painting. I had loved to paint in college, had even considered majoring in art before my practical parents convinced me to study education instead, something with job security. I walked into the admissions office right then and there. The young woman behind the desk couldn't have been more than 25, with purple streaks in her hair and a nose ring that would have scandalized my mother. She smiled at me warmly and asked how she could help. When I told her I wanted to register for the painting class, she didn't laugh or ask why a woman my age wanted to take a beginner's art class. She just pulled up the registration form and helped me enroll. As I walked out of that building with my class schedule in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Robert was furious when I told him about the class. He wanted to know who was going to make his dinner on Tuesday evenings, who was going to do the laundry that needed to be done that night, who was going to be home when he got back from his weekly poker game. I looked at him calmly and said he was a grown man who had managed to run a successful accounting firm for 30 years. Surely he could figure out how to heat up leftovers and run a washing machine. The look on his face would have been comical if it wasn't so sad. Please, if this story is touching you, if you see yourself in my struggle, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every single one counts. Click that subscribe button and join this journey with me. Your support means everything. My first art class was terrifying. I walked into a room full of easels and found myself surrounded by people of all ages, from college students to retirees. The instructor, a woman named Patricia who was probably in her 50s with wild curly hair and paint-stained fingers, welcomed me with such genuine warmth that I almost cried. She told us that in her class there were no mistakes, only discoveries. For the first time in my adult life, I was in a space where I was allowed to mess up, to experiment, to create something imperfect. I was terrible at first. My brush strokes were hesitant, my colors muddy, my compositions awkward. But Patricia would come to my easel and point out something beautiful in the chaos, a particular shade I had mixed, an interesting line, a moment of spontaneity. She taught me to see potential instead of failure. As the weeks went by, something inside me began to shift. I started to see the world differently, to notice the way light played on surfaces, the subtle gradations of color in a sunset, the beauty in ordinary things. Robert's resentment grew with each passing week. He started making passive-aggressive comments about my hobby, as he called it, asking how much this expensive midlife crisis was costing him. Never mind that I had worked as a substitute teacher for 15 years while raising our children, contributing to our household income while still being available for every school event and sick day. Never mind that I had given up my own teaching career when Michael was born, because Robert's job required frequent travel and someone needed to be home. My art class, which cost less than his monthly golf membership, was suddenly an extravagant waste. Things came to a head one Tuesday evening. I was getting ready to leave for class when Robert announced that he had invited his business partner and wife over for dinner that night. He had forgotten to mention it earlier, he said, but surely I could just skip my little painting class this once to be a proper hostess. I stood there with my art supplies in hand, and I had a choice to make. The old Margaret would have immediately apologized, canceled her plans, and rushed to prepare a dinner party. But I wasn't the old Margaret anymore. I told him no. I told him he should have consulted me before making plans, and since he hadn't, he would need to either reschedule or take his guests out to a restaurant. I walked out the door while he was still sputtering about how embarrassing this was, how selfish I was being, how he didn't even recognize me anymore. As I drove to class, my hands were shaking, but I didn't turn back. If you're still with me on this journey, please consider subscribing. Click that button and help me reach 1,000 subscribers. These stories matter. Your story matters. And together, we're building something important here. When I got home that night, the house was dark. Robert had left a note saying he had gone to stay at a hotel and needed time to think about whether he wanted to remain married to someone who had become so self-centered. I read that note 3 times, and instead of the panic I expected to feel, I felt something else. Relief. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't scrambling to fix things, to make him happy, to sacrifice my needs for his comfort. I went to bed in our big empty house and slept better than I had in years. Robert came back 3 days later, expecting me to apologize, to beg him to stay, to promise to be the wife he wanted. Instead, I told him I wanted marriage counseling. If we were going to stay together, things needed to change. We needed to become partners again, not just 2 people living in the same house. He agreed, but I could tell he thought the therapist would side with him, would tell me I was being unreasonable. Our first therapy session was eye-opening. Dr. Lisa Chen, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, listened to both of us carefully. Robert painted me as a woman who had suddenly become selfish and neglectful of her duties. He talked about the missed dinner party, the Tuesday evening art class, my new refusal to have his breakfast ready exactly at 7 every morning. When it was my turn, I talked about 40 years of putting everyone else first, about dreams deferred and sacrifices unacknowledged, about feeling like a servant rather than a partner. Dr. Chen asked Robert a simple question. When was the last time he had asked me about my day, my feelings, my dreams? He couldn't answer. She asked him to name 3 things that brought me joy. He couldn't answer that either. Then she asked me the same questions about him. I could answer them all. I knew he loved golf, that he felt most accomplished when solving complex financial problems, that he worried about his legacy and whether he had made a difference in the world. The imbalance in our relationship became crystal clear in that moment, even to Robert. But knowing there's a problem and being willing to change are 2 different things. Robert tried. I'll give him that. For a few weeks, he asked about my art class, complimented a painting I brought home, even loaded the dishwasher without being asked. But it felt performative, like he was checking boxes to satisfy the therapist, rather than genuinely engaging with me as a person. The resentment was still there, simmering beneath the surface of his efforts. Meanwhile, my life was expanding in ways I had never imagined. Patricia invited me to join a group of artists who met every Saturday morning to paint together at various locations around the county. I hesitated at first. Saturdays were when I did the big grocery shopping and meal prep for the week. But then I thought about that question again. What about my life? I started going to those Saturday painting sessions, and I discovered a community of creative, passionate people who saw me for who I was, not what I could do for them. I want to pause here and ask you something. If this story is inspiring you to think about your own life differently, please hit that subscribe button. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support helps this channel reach more people who need to hear that. It's never too late to choose yourself. Thank you for being here. One Saturday, we were painting at a local park when a man approached our group. His name was David, and he was a photographer working on a project about aging and creativity. He was particularly interested in my story when he learned I had only started painting seriously at 63. He asked if he could interview me for his project. I agreed, flattered, and a little nervous. David's questions made me think deeply about my journey. He asked why I had waited so long to pursue my passion, what had changed to make me finally take that step, how it felt to be discovering this part of myself so late in life. As I answered his questions, I realized that my story wasn't unique. Thousands, maybe millions of women had lived the same way I had, pouring all their energy into caring for others, believing that self-sacrifice was the same thing as love. The interview turned into a friendship. David was 70, a widower who had reinvented his life after his wife passed away 5 years earlier. He understood the fear and exhilaration of starting over in the third act of life. We started meeting for coffee after the Saturday painting sessions, talking about art and life and the courage it takes to change course when the world expects you to just fade quietly into old age. Robert saw David drop me off one Saturday afternoon, and his jealousy was immediate and irrational. He accused me of having an affair, of using my art class as a cover to meet men, of trying to destroy our family. The irony of his accusations wasn't lost on me, considering he had been emotionally absent from our marriage for decades. But I didn't defend myself or explain my friendship with David. I simply told Robert that if he couldn't trust me, if he couldn't be happy that I had finally found something that brought me joy, then maybe we needed to seriously reconsider our marriage. That conversation was the beginning of the end. Robert gave me an ultimatum: stop the art classes, stop the Saturday painting sessions, stop seeing David, and commit to being the wife he had married, or he would file for divorce. He seemed so certain I would choose our marriage, choose the security and familiarity of our life together, choose him over my newfound independence. I chose myself. I told him I wouldn't give up the pieces of my life that made me feel alive, that made me feel like a whole person rather than just someone's wife or mother. If that meant divorce, then we should start the process. The shock on his face told me he had never actually expected me to call his bluff. He moved out the next day, packing his things with angry, jerky movements, while muttering about lawyers and splitting assets, and how I would regret this. My children's reactions were mixed. Jessica called me crying, begging me to reconsider, telling me I was throwing away 4 decades of marriage over a silly art class. She couldn't understand that it wasn't about the art class. It was about everything the art class represented. My right to exist as an individual, to have desires and dreams, to be more than just a supporting character in everyone else's story. Michael, who I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly called to lecture me about family values and commitment, which was rich coming from someone who had cut me off for not being an endless ATM machine. Please, if you're finding strength in this story, if you're thinking about what changes you need to make in your own life, subscribe to this channel. Click that button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your support matters, and so does your story. The divorce process was brutal. Robert tried to paint me as mentally unstable, going through some kind of breakdown. His lawyer brought up my age, implied that I might be experiencing cognitive decline or early dementia. They tried to use my newfound passion for art as evidence of irrationality. But my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rachel, who reminded me a bit of myself before I lost my way, fought back hard. She brought in Dr. Chen, who testified that I was actually the healthiest she had seen me, that I was finally addressing decades of repressed needs and desires. The worst part was the reaction from our social circle. The other wives in our country club community couldn't understand why I would leave a perfectly good marriage. Robert was successful, faithful as far as anyone knew, and provided well for me. What more did I want? They dropped me from bridge games and charity committees, as if my choice to prioritize my own happiness was somehow contagious. I realized that many of these women were living the same half-life I had been, and my decision to leave threatened their own carefully constructed illusions. But for every friend I lost, I gained new ones. The artists I painted with rallied around me, offering support and understanding. Patricia became not just my teacher, but a true friend, someone who had walked a similar path years earlier. David continued to be a steady presence, never pushing for more than friendship, just being there as someone who understood the courage it took to rebuild a life. The financial settlement was fair, though Robert fought me on every detail out of spite. I got the house, which I immediately put on the market. I didn't want to live in that shrine to my old life anymore. I found a small cottage closer to the downtown area, with huge windows that flooded the space with natural light, perfect for painting. It needed work, but it was mine, a fresh start in every sense. Moving into that cottage at 64 felt like being reborn. I painted the walls in colors I loved, hung my own artwork, arranged furniture in ways that made sense for how I wanted to live, rather than how I was supposed to live. I set up a proper studio space in the spare bedroom, with my easel positioned to catch the morning light. I adopted a rescue cat, a gray tabby named Luna, who had also been looking for a second chance at happiness. Jessica eventually came around, though it took time. She visited my new place 6 months after I moved in, and I could see the surprise in her eyes. She had expected to find me living in some dingy apartment, depressed and regretting my choices. Instead, she found me thriving in a sun-filled cottage, surrounded by my paintings, genuinely happy for the first time in her memory. We had a long conversation that day where I explained that I wasn't rejecting my life as her mother. I was reclaiming my life as Margaret, a woman who existed before she became a wife and mother, and would continue to exist as an individual. Michael never did come around. He remained angry with me, I think because my choice to leave a marriage that wasn't fulfilling challenged his own relationship with his wife, which I suspected had similar dynamics. Some people aren't ready to question their choices, and that's their journey to take or not take. I had to let go of the guilt about that. Had to accept that I couldn't make everyone understand or approve of my decisions. If this story is resonating with you, if you're seeing yourself in my struggle or finding inspiration for your own journey, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of people who believe it's never too late to choose yourself, to reclaim your life, to ask that vital question. What about my life? Click that subscribe button and be part of this movement. My art progressed in ways I never imagined. Patricia encouraged me to enter a local art show, and I was terrified but did it anyway. 3 of my paintings were accepted, and one of them sold on the opening night. The feeling of watching someone carefully examine my work, seeing something in it that moved them enough to purchase it, was indescribable. I wasn't just Margaret the wife, Margaret the mother, Margaret the invisible woman who kept everyone's life running smoothly. I was Margaret the artist, someone who created beauty and meaning in the world. David's photography project expanded into a full exhibition called Blooming Late, featuring stories and portraits of people who had found their passion in the second half of life. My story was prominently featured, my portrait showing me at my easel, paintbrush in hand, with a quote about it, "Never being too late to become who you were meant to be." The exhibition traveled to several galleries around New England, and I received letters from dozens of people, mostly women, telling me that my story had inspired them to make changes in their own lives. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Carol who was 58 and had been contemplating leaving a marriage that had been emotionally dead for years. She wrote that seeing my story, knowing that I had found happiness and purpose at 63, gave her the courage to finally make that change. She thanked me for being brave enough to share my journey, for making her feel less alone in her struggle. I cried when I read that letter, understanding for the first time that my painful journey had meaning beyond just my own life. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, I organized my first solo exhibition. Patricia helped me select and frame 20 of my best pieces, and we found a small gallery willing to give me a month-long show. The opening night was one of the most terrifying and exhilarating experiences of my life. I stood in that gallery, surrounded by my paintings, each one representing a piece of my journey toward self-discovery, and I felt proud in a way I had never felt before. Jessica came to the opening, bringing her girlfriend, something she had finally felt comfortable sharing with me during one of our honest conversations. She told me that watching me have the courage to change my life had given her the courage to stop hiding who she really was. We stood together in front of a painting I had titled Emergence, which showed a butterfly just breaking free from its chrysalis, and she squeezed my hand. In that moment, I understood that choosing myself hadn't destroyed my family. It had actually freed us all to be more authentic. Robert showed up toward the end of the evening. I hadn't invited him, but the exhibition had been covered in the local paper. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching me interact with visitors, laugh with my artist friends, explain my techniques and inspiration to people who were genuinely interested. When our eyes finally met, I saw something in his face I couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe, or confusion, or perhaps just the recognition that I had become someone he no longer knew. He approached me cautiously after most of the visitors had left. He looked older, grayer, somehow smaller than I remembered. He told me the paintings were good, really good, and that he hadn't realized I had this talent. Then he said something that surprised me. He was sorry. Sorry for not seeing me, for taking me for granted, for treating my dreams and desires as less important than his own. He didn't ask me to come back to him, and I appreciated that. He just wanted me to know that he had finally understood what I had been trying to tell him, even if that understanding had come too late. I want to pause here and ask you again to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories need to be told. These journeys need to be shared, and your subscription helps make that possible. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and every single one matters. Click that button and join this community. David and I grew closer over time, but our relationship remained one of deep friendship rather than romance. There was an intimacy in our connection that didn't need to be romantic to be fulfilling. We were two people who had found each other at the right time, who understood each other's journey, who celebrated each other's continued growth and evolution. Sometimes the love story isn't about finding a romantic partner. It's about finding yourself and the people who see and appreciate who you really are. My life now, at 67, looks nothing like I imagined it would at this age. I'm not the grandmother baking cookies and babysitting grandchildren, though I would love to have grandchildren someday if Jessica decides she wants children. I'm not the dutiful wife maintaining a household and supporting a husband's career. I'm not fading quietly into comfortable irrelevance. Instead, I'm a working artist with a growing reputation, someone who teaches painting workshops to other late bloomers, someone who wakes up excited about each day and what it might bring. I won't pretend the journey has been easy. There were nights in that first year after the divorce when I lay awake wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, if security and companionship, even the hollow kind, were better than the uncertainty of living alone. There were moments when I questioned whether my art was good enough, whether I had any right to call myself an artist at my age. There were family gatherings I wasn't invited to anymore, friendships that couldn't survive my transformation, financial worries that kept me up at night. But there were also mornings when I woke up to sunlight streaming through my cottage windows, with Luna purring beside me, and felt a peace I had never known in my old life. There were moments at my easel when I got so lost in the process of creating that hours passed without me noticing. There were conversations with other women who told me my story had changed their lives, given them permission to want more, to be more. There were paintings that seemed to come through me rather than from me, as if some part of myself I had buried decades ago was finally free to express itself. Patricia once told me that the most radical thing a woman can do in this culture is choose herself without apology. I didn't understand what she meant at first, but I do now. We're taught from birth that our value lies in how well we serve others, how much we sacrifice, how completely we can subsume our own needs and desires for the sake of our families. To say no to that, to insist on your own personhood and your own dreams, to take up space and resources for your own development, that's revolutionary. I think about all the years I spent waiting for permission to live my own life. Permission from my parents to pursue art instead of a practical career. Permission from my husband to have interests and passions outside of our marriage. Permission from my children to be something other than an endlessly available mother. Permission from society to want more than the prescribed role of wife and mother. I waited, and the years slipped by, and I became smaller and smaller, more and more invisible. The truth I finally learned is that no one was ever going to give me that permission. I had to give it to myself. I had to decide that my life mattered, that my dreams were valid, that my happiness was important. Not more important than everyone else's, but not less important either. Equal, valid, worthy of pursuit. Before we near the end of this story, I want to ask you one more time to please subscribe to this channel. If my journey has touched you, if it's made you think about your own life differently, clicking that subscribe button is a small way to say that these stories matter. We're building toward 1,000 subscribers, and with your help, we can reach people all over the world who need to hear that it's never too late to bloom. Now, I run workshops called What About Your Life, where I teach painting to women over 50 who have spent their lives caring for others and are finally ready to do something just for themselves. The first session is always the same. I have them sit with a blank canvas and ask them to paint their dreams, not the dreams they've been told to have, but the ones they've kept hidden away. You should see these women, some of them crying as they paint, releasing decades of repressed desires and creativity. One woman, a 70-year-old named Dorothy, painted a map of South America. When I asked her about it, she told me she had always wanted to travel there, to see Machu Picchu and the Amazon rainforest, but her husband had no interest in adventure travel. He had passed away 2 years earlier, and she still hadn't gone, was still waiting for someone to go with her, still putting her dream on hold. I asked her a simple question. What are you waiting for? 6 months later, she sent me a postcard from Peru. She had gone alone, had the adventure of her lifetime, and was planning her next solo trip to Patagonia. These are the stories that fuel me now, that give my own journey meaning beyond just my personal happiness. Every woman who finds the courage to choose herself, to pursue her own dreams, to ask that vital question, what about my life? That's a small revolution. And enough small revolutions can change the world. My relationship with my own identity continues to evolve. Some days I still struggle with guilt, with the internalized voice that tells me I'm selfish for prioritizing my own needs. But those days are fewer now, and I've learned to recognize that voice for what it is, not truth, but conditioning. I'm learning to be gentle with myself, to celebrate my progress, rather than berating myself for not being further along. I've also learned that choosing yourself isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily practice, a continual recommitment to your own worth and your own dreams. Some days that choice is easy, even joyful. Other days it's hard, requiring me to set boundaries or disappoint someone, or sit with uncomfortable feelings. But each time I make that choice, it gets a little easier, a little more natural. Jessica and I have developed a relationship that's more honest and equal than it ever was when I was just mom, the person who existed to meet her needs. We talk about art and relationships and the challenges of living authentically in a world that's constantly trying to force us into prescribed roles. She's become one of my biggest supporters, often sharing my artwork on her social media and bringing her friends to my exhibitions. She told me recently that she used to think I was the perfect mother because I was always available, always sacrificing, always putting everyone else first. Now she realizes that version of me was also teaching her some dangerous lessons about women's worth and women's roles. The mother I am now, the one who has boundaries and dreams and a life of her own, is actually a better role model, even if she's less convenient. Michael and I are still estranged, but I've made peace with that. I've written him letters explaining my journey, not to justify myself, but to offer him insight into who I really am beyond the role of mother he knew. He hasn't responded, and that's his choice. I can't control whether he understands or approves. I can only control my own actions and my own commitment to living authentically. I've even found a way to forgive Robert, not for his sake, but for mine. Carrying anger and resentment was like drinking poison and expecting him to get sick. I've come to understand that he was also trapped by societal expectations, by rigid ideas about what it meant to be a man, a husband, a provider. He couldn't see me because he had never learned to really see anyone, including himself. That doesn't excuse his behavior, but it makes it comprehensible, human. The product of conditioning rather than pure malice. As I approach 70, I'm already thinking about the next chapter. I want to travel more, to paint in different places, to continue pushing the boundaries of what I'm capable of creating. I want to expand my workshops, maybe write a book about late-blooming creativity and second-act courage. I want to continue being visible and vocal about the possibility of transformation at any age, because that's what this story is really about. Not just my personal journey, but the universal truth that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. We live in a culture obsessed with youth, with potential, with the idea that life is essentially over after a certain age. But I'm living proof that some of the best chapters of life can come in the later volumes, that growth and transformation and joy are possible at any age if we're brave enough to reach for them. The question I asked myself on my 63rd birthday, what about my life, wasn't just a moment of existential crisis. It was an awakening, a calling to something more, a refusal to accept that my story was already written and finished. Every person has the right to ask that question, regardless of age or circumstances. What about my life? What about my dreams? What about my happiness? What about my potential? And once you ask that question, really ask it with an open heart and a willingness to hear the answer, you can't go back to sleepwalking through your life. You become awake, aware, alive in a way you may never have been before. It's terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely worth it. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. Your time and attention mean the world to me. And if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers and spread this message that it's never too late, that your life matters, that you deserve to be more than just a supporting character in everyone else's story. Subscribe, and let's continue this journey together. I paint almost every day now, and each canvas is a conversation with myself, an exploration of who I'm becoming, a celebration of the courage it took to get here. Some paintings are dark, acknowledging the pain and struggle of the journey. Others are bright and joyful, capturing the exhilaration of freedom. All of them are honest, which is the most important thing. Looking back, I don't regret my years as a wife and mother. Those roles gave me my children, whom I love deeply, and taught me valuable lessons about love and commitment and sacrifice. But I do regret waiting so long to also be Margaret, to claim space for my own dreams and desires, to insist on my own personhood. If I could go back and give my younger self advice, I would tell her that she doesn't have to choose between being a good mother and wife and being herself. She can be all of those things, but only if she remembers that she matters too. To anyone listening who is feeling invisible, taken for granted, or lost in the roles they play for others, I want you to know that you can choose differently. It might be messy. It might be painful. It might cost you things you thought were permanent. But on the other side of that fear and uncertainty is a life that's truly yours. A life lived on your own terms. A life that honors who you really are. You don't have to wait until you're 63 to ask yourself, what about my life? You can ask it now, today, this moment. And then you can begin the beautiful, terrifying, essential work of living your answer. Because you matter. Your dreams matter. Your happiness matters. Your life matters. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And please, if you believe these stories need to be told and heard, subscribe to this channel. Click that button, help us reach 1,000 subscribers, and let's keep sharing these stories of courage and transformation and late-blooming joy. Until next time, remember to ask yourself, what about my life? And then have the courage to live your answer.